My name is Pete Moore from the Department of Political Science here at Case Western Reserve University. I'd like to start by thanking the History Department here for supporting the event today, as well as to thank the Schools of Arts and Sciences here at Case Western Reserve, as well as Kent State for providing funding for the Northeast Ohio Consortium for Middle East Studies to put on events like this. For the last several years, we've been bringing scholars and intellectuals to our campuses and our communities to speak about wide-ranging issues in the modern Middle East. One of the roles of this university and universities in general is to host and engage difficult and controversial issues. That's what universities do. And the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is one such important issue. So to ensure open discussion and engagement, we want to articulate a clear policy in reference to this event. So this is an open space, and there will be an opportunity for open questions and comments. No speeches, please, after the talk. If you have a comment, we ask you keep it concise. Given that this is an open lecture, we want to create a safe space for faculty and students and our community to discuss, so disruptions will not be accepted. If there is disruptions, you'll be asked to leave. Lastly, we've gone to great lengths to ensure that this event is going to be videotaped, and we will put it up on a free public website for all to see. So just on those issues, thank you for your cooperation. Our speaker today is Professor Joel Beinin. His research and writing focuses on workers, peasants, minorities in the modern Middle East, and on Israel-Palestine and the Arab-Israeli conflict. He is the Donald J. McLaughlin Professor of History and Professor of Middle East History at Stanford University. He studied at the American University of Cairo and at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Since 1983, I hope you don't mind me saying that, Joel, he has taught Middle East history at Stanford University. And in 2002, he was elected to the presidency of the Middle East Studies Association, which is our leading scholarly association for the study of the region. He's written or edited 9 books, most recently Social Movements, Mobilization, and Contestation in the Middle East and North Africa, which is for sale in the back. And just finally, aside from these formal achievements, Professor Beinin is a scholar really at the top of his game, so to speak. He's a genuine leader in the field of Middle East studies. He's been a mentor and a friend, not just to his many students, but to many of us who don't study the same parts of the region that he studies or are not specifically in the discipline of history. And so in this sense, I think I speak for a lot of younger faculty who have long appreciated his work and advocacy in this important field. So we're quite fortunate today to have Professor Beinin join us, and I'll avoid the obvious weather jokes for people coming from California and just say welcome to Cleveland and welcome to Case Western Reserve University.
Thank you, Pete, for that very generous introduction, and thank you all for coming. Doug McAdam was the first to make a distinction between normal political protest and what he called high-risk activism. This distinction was based on his study of the Mississippi Freedom Summer Project of 1964. Hundreds of mostly white Northerners went to Mississippi that year to help register African Americans to vote and to teach literacy and other subjects in freedom schools. On June 21st, 3 project volunteers, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, were shot dead by members of the Ku Klux Klan, grimly highlighting the high risks their activities entailed. McAdam argued that 4 factors explain the recruitment to high-risk activism. 1, attitudinal affinity, that is, ideological or political identification with the values of the movement. 2, integration into activist networks, meaning friends, family, and acquaintances in the movement. 3, a prior history of activism. And 4, the absence of personal constraints on participation, for example, being young and single. Of these, the most significant was integration into activist networks. Very few scholars have sought to elaborate on or challenge McAdam's conclusions or to test them in other contexts. What I propose is to do so by examining Palestinian-Israeli international joint action against the Israeli occupation of the West Bank, part of the territories conquered in the 1967 war. I concur with McAdam that while ideological commitment is a necessary component of high-risk activism, it is not sufficient. But I differ with him in arguing that social relationships formed in the course of struggle, not prior to engaging in high-risk activism, that is, sharing intense emotional moments of fear, victory, and defeat, and facing violence together, are the most important motivators in participation in high-risk activism, and especially in the transition from moderately risky to high-risk activism. The International Solidarity Movement, ISM, consciously invoked the precedent of Mississippi Freedom Summer by designating its 2002 campaign of Palestine Solidarity Action Freedom Summer, a good reason for testing McAdams' theoretical propositions in this context. Protesting the occupation in any form has always been a high-risk activity for Palestinians who have and continue to regularly experience tear gas, beatings, and live fire from Israeli security forces. Therefore, the new phenomenon to be explained is the participation of Israelis and internationals in qualitatively new ways involving high risk: social reprobation, arrests and trials, tear gas asphyxiation, and other forms of severe physical discomfort, serious bodily injuries, and in a few cases, death. With the outbreak of the Second Palestinian Intifada in September 2000, the modalities of resistance to Israel's occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip changed. The Second Intifada began as unarmed protests, but in response to Israel's massive militarized repression of the early demonstrations, armed action by a minority of young men upstaged all other forms of activism. After most armed resistance was smashed by the Israeli military, the construction of a separation barrier in the West Bank, the apartheid wall in Palestinian parlance, the fence in Israeli lingo, prompted an unprecedented level of engagement of Israelis and foreigners with Palestinians under Palestinian leadership and with Palestinian initiative in grassroots protests known as popular resistance in the Palestinian lexicon. This engagement is continuing today, though it is relatively weaker than it was at its high point in 2003, 2005. From its inception, this activity was perceived as risky by many Israelis and foreign volunteers, or at least moderately risky. Why did Israelis, a large proportion of them teenagers to 30-somethings from comfortable middle-class families, hardly any of them Arabic speakers prior to their activist careers, engage in such protests along with Palestinians and internationals in the face of escalating Israeli repression? The answer to this question begins with events in the West Bank village of Jayus near Kalkilia. In September 2002, Jayus became the first Palestinian village to begin regular protest against the separation barrier that Israel had begun constructing 3 months earlier. Israel occupied about 20% of Jayus's lands after the 1948 war. They are located on the west side of the Green Line, that is the 1948-1967 Armistice Line. The trajectory of the separation barrier put an additional 75% of Jayus's remaining lands, including its most fertile land, all its irrigated lands, 7 wells, and 12,000 olive trees on the western side of the barrier. So this is Jayus here, and this is the trajectory of the barrier, which you can see nearly encircling Kalkilia, and the point of doing that is to include these purple settlements on the western side of the barrier. In order to work their lands west of the barrier, farmers had to apply for permits to pass through its agricultural gates, which were only scheduled to open for 1 hour 3 times a day. In Jayus and other villages, the Israeli army has often delayed opening or failed to open the gates altogether. Many farming families never received permits, were unable to renew their permits, or were given permits for fewer family members than were required to do the agricultural work on their lands. Sharif Omar, known as Abu Azam, is the leader of the Jayus Land Defense Committee and the largest landowner in Jayus. His loquat trees, his most valuable crop, are all located west of the barrier. Abu Azam recalled that when he first learned of the trajectory of the barrier, people burst into tears. Some fainted. Jayus's 3,000 residents depend almost entirely on agricultural income. So this means a loss of our livelihoods, dreams, hopes, future, and heritage. Since Abu Azam was a member of the Fatah party, he had access to Palestinian Authority officials who gave him the names of Palestinian contacts, but no practical assistance. Abu Azam also called on Yaakov Manor, an Israeli Jewish member of Ta'ayush, Arab-Jewish Partnership, for help. Ta'ayush and several other Israeli organizations and internationals mobilized to participate in demonstrations against the separation barrier at Jayus. Abu Azam warmly welcomed the participation of Israelis and internationals. He proudly referred to Lisa Nesson, one of several members of Bay Area Jewish Voice for Peace, which is now a national organization, who went to Jayus with the International Solidarity Movement, as my daughter. Lisa and others spent several months in Jayus. One Israeli, Nirit, recalled her time in Jayus, hosted by Abu Azam. I was in Tel Aviv, she wrote, visiting my family when I got a phone call from a Jewish American colleague in Jayus who was there with the ISM. You have to come here, he said. They want Israelis to come. I could not fathom how that could be true. How the people of Jayus could welcome us, people of the nation who were seeking time and time again to destroy them. But I went anyway, knowing that I would have to go there to understand. Within only a few hours in Jayus, I felt as if the whole village had come to introduce themselves and invite me to their homes. Later, back in Tel Aviv, I was asked about Jayus. You should go and visit them, I said. They want you to come. It is not time yet, some said. We are afraid, said others. You are crazy, said others. One afternoon, I asked my host why he wanted the Israelis to come to Jayus. We and the Israelis have to live together, he said. How can we live together if Israelis don't know what is happening to us? Abu Azam chose the path of popular resistance and joint struggle with Israelis because he envisioned a future of living together with them rather than separation. As he wrote in USA Today in August 2003, when construction of the barrier at Jayus was nearly complete, as a father, I feel pain when my children are hurt. I have the same feeling for Israelis. I don't want to cause them pain. Peaceful resistance also avoids giving the Israeli military justifications to kill more Palestinians. I hope peaceful protests will leave a positive impact on Israeli soldiers and strengthen our partnership with Israeli peace groups. I don't even want them to build the wall on the Green Line because it will truly be an apartheid wall, preventing the development of understanding between our cultures. It's so important for us to find one language for peace. As Nirit indicated, many Israelis considered the West Bank a dangerous place. Her friends in the Tel Aviv bubble, as it is known, told her, "We are afraid you are crazy." Before arriving, she could not be sure how dangerous her visit to Jayus might be. In fact, the demonstrations involved no arrests or injuries to Israelis or internationals, despite the threats of the police to arrest them for trespassing. Nirit felt completely safe during her visit. Abu Azam, Nirit Ben-Ari, and many other participants in similar actions over the following years were motivated by a desire for peace based on Palestinians and Israelis living together. This is a fundamentally different vision than what most of the so-called Israeli peace movement advocates. Labor Zionists have advocated separation between Jews and Arabs in Palestine since the early 20th century. In the 1992 Labor Party election campaign, the slogan was, "Us here, them there, peace with Rabin." That is the late Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. Former Prime Ministers Rabin and Ehud Barak often used this phrase, comparing the peace they sought to a divorce. The positive attachments Abu Azam, Nirit Ben-Ari, and others like them experienced were based on the hope that a shared, not a separate future could be built. Palestinians and Israelis engaging in unarmed protest against the occupation regime provided a glimpse of what a shared life based on equality might look like. It was empowering, joyful, and liberatory. I suggest, therefore, that there is an important affective element motivating high-risk activism for both Palestinian and Israeli participants. In what follows, I discuss several cases of joint struggle, elaborating on the argument for an affective component to moderate and high-risk activism. Before doing so, it is helpful to appreciate the broader context. The discussion of the possibility of constructing a separation barrier between Israel and the West Bank began with the Labor Party governments of Yitzhak Rabin and Ehud Barak in the 1990s. Coming from the opposite end of the Zionist political spectrum, the National Unity Government led by Barak's successor Prime Minister Ariel Sharon authorized the construction of the West Bank separation barrier on June 23, 2002. I'm sorry, that national unity word got in there it was deleted from a previous sentence. It wasn't a national unity government, it was a Likud government. Sharon abandoned the historical desire of the Israeli right to annex the entire West Bank and embraced the concept of separation after reluctantly concluding that this was demographically impossible if Israel were to remain a majority Jewish state. About 85% of the barrier is inside the West Bank, that is, east of the green line marking the border between Israel and the West Bank from 1949 to 1967. About 95% of the barrier consists of an elaborate system of electronic fences, patrol roads, and observation towers constructed on a 300-meter wide path where possible. About 5%, mostly around Kalkilia and Jerusalem, consists of an 8-meter high concrete wall. By mid-2012, 439 kilometers of the barrier, about 62%, were completed, and 56 kilometers were still under construction. The remaining 212 kilometers, about 30% of the trajectory of the barrier, have not been completed for budgetary reasons. It's unlikely that they ever will be at this point. On its currently approved trajectory, the barrier would enclose about 9.5% of the West Bank between it and the Green Line, and completely or partially isolate another 3.4%. All Israeli proposals for a negotiated resolution of the conflict envision annexing the Jewish settlements and the Palestinian agricultural lands to the west of the barrier. The area between the Green Line and the barrier is known as the Seam Zone. It has been a closed military area since 2003, functionally detaching it from the West Bank and annexing it to Israel. Dozens of Palestinian villages just east of the Seam Zone have engaged in popular resistance, protesting the barrier's isolation or confiscation of their agricultural lands. This resistance has consisted of daily or weekly demonstrations, efforts to physically stop bulldozers from digging the foundations of the barrier, people chaining themselves to olive trees to prevent their being uprooted, cutting the barrier open, climbing on and shaking the barrier in sections where it is a fence, and painting graffiti on sections of the barrier where it is a concrete wall. Israelis and internationals have participated in all these forms of protest. Beginning in Jayus in the fall of 2002, village-based popular committees initiated and led popular resistance to the construction of the separation barrier with support from Israelis and internationals. These mobilizations did not rely on the Palestinian Authority or political elites, though they sometimes offered occasional assistance. Affiliations with political parties sometimes provided access to networks facilitating mobilization, but in no case was the local action the result of a decision by central party bodies. Local popular committees often initiated contacts with other villages to exchange information and tactics. They also sometimes approached political elites to try to recruit them to their cause. On some occasions, large numbers of Palestinians from outside a given village, along with Israelis and internationals, were mobilized to participate in demonstrations or other actions. Throughout the 2000s, with some exceptions, local villagers both led the movement and were the majority of the activists. With the halt in the construction of the barrier towards the end of the decade, demonstrations became smaller in some villages, but in others, like Nabi Saleh and Beit Omar, demonstrations continued over appropriations of land by settlers, a regular aspect of the occupation unrelated to the separation barrier. Adopting the rural example, popular committees in Jerusalem neighborhoods threatened with annexation, like Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan, have also organized popular resistance with support from Israelis and internationals. Demonstrations in Silwan have often involved violent confrontations with the settlers and police. Each village was, not surprisingly, primarily concerned with its own lands. The local focus of mobilizations, the massive repression of Israeli security forces and its network of collaborators, the fragmentation of the Palestinian political community, and the reserved attitudes of Palestinian political elites in Ramallah were all obstacles to forming a coordinated movement throughout the West Bank. Following Palestinian political usage in Arabic, although often not in English, I refer to this social movement as popular resistance or popular struggle rather than a nonviolent or peace movement. Accounts of the movement by foreigners commonly romanticize its nonviolence. While there is no use of firearms or other weapons, Palestinian youth throwing stones at Israeli soldiers who claim to be protecting the barrier or some other potential target is a regular feature of demonstrations in some, but not in all villages. Many international and Israeli activists avoid this issue on the grounds that raising questions about it is inconsistent with solidarity with Palestinians. Whether or not stone throwing falls under the rubric of nonviolence is an important philosophical, political, and perhaps even theological question, but this is not my purpose here, so I will simply continue after acknowledging the issue. The Palestinian Authority has been largely uninterested in popular resistance to the barrier. Abdel Nasser Murar, one of the coordinators of the highly successful mobilization against the barrier in Budrus, complained, "The Palestinian Authority has lapsed in its responsibilities toward all the villages. In the entire West Bank, right now, whatever efforts the PA, the Palestinian Authority, makes are focused on the village of Beinin. Not a single PA official came to Budrus when the wall was being constructed. It wasn't until Budrus started a march to the Council of Ministers that we were able to talk to an official. He acted as though he was doing us a favor by talking to us or holding a press conference. The PA just doesn't have the interest. The PA didn't help at all." As a result of the Israeli army's reoccupation of the major cities of the West Bank in the spring of 2002 and the destruction of much of the physical and logistical infrastructure of the Palestinian Authority, its capacities were severely diminished. However, a Palestinian Authority with more capacity and similar political characteristics would probably not have dealt differently with the village-based movement. The PA has a ministry for the wall and settlements. Beginning in 2012, both the PA and former Prime Minister Salam Fayyad attempted to coordinate, many would say co-opt, village-based popular committees which had been forming competing alliances. But the PA has never regarded grassroots resistance as a significant element in its political strategy. The characteristic attitude of PA officials was expressed by the governor of the Salfit district, Issam Abu Bakr, who, speaking from his rather posh office, said, "The struggle against the wall strengthens our position in the negotiations." For Palestinians, the outbreak of the Second Intifada in September 2000 led to a dramatic escalation of violent repression. In October 2000, Israeli police shot dead 13 Palestinian citizens of Israel in the course of unarmed demonstrations expressing solidarity with the Second Intifada. The events of October, as they are known, led to the formation of Ta'ayush, Arab-Jewish Partnership, a direct action group which undertook what I would characterize as moderately risky activism for Jewish Israelis by organizing Palestinian, Arab, and Jewish Israeli citizens to deliver food, medicine, blankets, and other supplies to villages in the West Bank under siege by the Israeli army. These actions brought Jews, including some who had never been there before, to the West Bank, while a low-level armed struggle was underway. However, the caravans were well coordinated with village councils or popular committees. Only rarely were serious injuries associated with this activity. The village of Yanun in October 2002 is a notable exception. There were arrests, but charges were usually dismissed or minor. During the first stages of popular resistance and joint struggle against the separation barrier in 2002 and 2003, the risk of participating in such actions increased gradually for Israelis and internationals. Regular militant protests against the separation barrier eventually resulted in the IDF deploying tear gas, stun grenades, pepper balls, scream machines, rubber-coated metal bullets, and live ammunition to disperse demonstrators. The innovation of the period of struggle against the separation barrier after the fall 2002 demonstrations at Jayus was the death of 2 foreigners and the serious injury of perhaps a dozen Israeli Jews and foreigners. In the same period, the IDF killed some 20 Palestinians and wounded hundreds during unarmed demonstrations. On March 24, 2003, construction of the barrier began at Masha, a small village with a population of 1,800 in the Salfit district. The settlement of El Kana, built on Jayus's land, on Masha's land, sorry. This is El-Qana here. That's Masha there. The settlement of El-Qana, built on Masha's lands in 1977 during Yitzhak Rabin's first term as prime minister, lies just west of Masha. The villagers of Masha were faced with the prospect of losing regular access to over 90% of their lands located on the western or Israeli side of the barrier. When construction of the barrier began, Nazih Shalabi, a volunteer with the General Committee of the Land Defense Committee and a member of Palestinian People's Party, formerly the Communist Party, who lost access to 120 out of 125 dunams of his land, a dunam is about a quarter of an acre, behind the wall, contacted the Land Defense Committee and Palestinian People's Party members in Salfit. Shalabi had no prior contact with Israeli or international activists. Through connections of the Palestinian People's Party, many Palestinian, Israeli, and international organizations, from well-established peace groups to newer queer and animal liberation groups, were invited to attend the first demonstration against the separation barrier at Masha on March 29, 2003. Shalabi and the Palestinian left quickly emerged as the driving force behind the popular resistance at Masha. A larger demonstration of perhaps 500 people on April 5th ended with pitching 2 tents on what was projected to be the western side of the barrier. It hadn't yet been built. The tents became the center of the Masha peace camp. For 4 months, Palestinians, Israelis, and internationals maintained a constant presence at the camp, engaging in direct democracy decision-making about the course of the protest and disseminating information to the Israeli and international media. Hundreds of Israelis spent a night at the Masha peace camp. Many stayed for days or weeks at a time. The Masha camp was a socio-political incubator. Young, queer, vegan, animal liberationist, radical Israelis, both individuals and previously existing anarchist-style affinity groups, shared emotionally intense experiences with mostly like-minded young internationals and left-wing Palestinians like Nazih Shalabi, who defied Masha's social conservatism and embraced the young radicals. Some of the Israelis came from families with more traditional left political affiliations. Others made a sharp break with the norms of their families. The willingness of young Israelis to establish relations with Palestinians based on equality was in some cases due to prior ideological commitments, even if they were vague. In others, it was an extension of attitudes and behaviors such as support for animal rights, veganism, or queer identity that were already on the edge of the Israeli social consensus, but not at first linked to views on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. The unconventional cultural and social norms of the Masha peace camp and the leading role of the Palestinian People's Party were used as a wedge by Fatah, Islamists, and others to attack Nazih Shalabi. Punk culture, anti-militarism, and the queer, animal liberation, environmental, and anti-globalization movements all contributed to the formation of the group that eventually became known as Anarchists Against the Wall. The cosmopolitan political influence of the international solidarity movement was also a factor. More than any specific political platform, Anarchists Against the Wall came to represent a nearly total rejection of Israeli political and cultural norms. Some future Anarchists Against the Wall members had previous experience with Ta'ayush or older pro-peace organizations like Peace Now or Peace Bloc. However, the intimate relations they developed with Palestinians and internationals and 4 months of intense political debate and social and cultural exchange moved them far beyond what other Israeli organizations had been prepared to do in solidarity with Palestinians. Rather than verbally supporting Palestinian rights, planning and attending demonstrations, providing material aid, all successively higher risk activities, they sought to engage in joint direct action. For some, learning to speak Arabic was a natural consequence of spending extended periods of time in Masha and other villages and coordinating political activity under Palestinian leadership. The first joint direct action was planned at the Masha peace camp. On July 28th, about 150 Israelis and 35 Palestinians and 35 internationals cut the fence at Kafr Anin. 5 ISM volunteers were wounded by rubber-coated metal bullets in the action, one seriously enough to require evacuation to a hospital. But as Jonathan Pollack recalled, the presence of Israelis imposed some restraints on the army's use of force. He said, "There were rubber bullets and there was tear gas, but there was no live ammunition and no one was seriously injured." He has a very high threshold for what he considers being seriously injured. Anarchist Against the Wall was the main Israeli group in a similar action at Zbuba, a village with a population of about 2,400. 1/5 of Zbuba's 2,500 acres was isolated behind the barrier. On November 9th, 2003, the anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, about 100 Palestinians, Israelis, and internationals marched from the center of the village to the separation barrier, where they removed a 20 to 30 meter section of the fence before the eyes of perplexed Israeli soldiers. So this is the first phase of the barrier here in the northern West Bank, and this is Kafr Anin, and this is Zbuba here. The most active Palestinians in the Masha peace camp, although they tended to be on the left beforehand, deepened their commitment to what we might call a humanist internationalist outlook, although their capacity for further action was much more constrained than that of the Israelis. The tent worked well. I loved it. I loved it more than my own house. Those 4 months were the best time of my life, recalled Nazir Shalabi, even though they were bad times for my family. Nonetheless, Shalabi had no illusions about what the Masha peace camp could accomplish. We, the Masha farmers, and our supporters knew from the beginning that we could not stop the wall in Masha or remove it, but we wanted to show that the Israeli people are not our enemies, to provide an opportunity for Israelis to cooperate with us as good neighbors and support our struggle. Our camp showed that peace will not be built by walls and separation, but by cooperation and communication between the two peoples living in this land. At Masha Peace Camp, we lived together, ate together, and talked together 24 hours a day for 4 months. Our fear was never from each other, but only from the Israeli soldiers and settlers. Nazir Shalabi's assessment of what should be feared was entirely correct. On August 5th and 6th, the Israeli army forcefully shut down the Masha peace camp. Over 70 Palestinians, internationals, and Israelis were arrested. The camp was demolished and the tents were confiscated. On August 13th, the area of the Masha camp was declared a closed military zone. Shalabi was arrested and detained for 3 days. Despite its failure to stop the barrier, the Masha camp established a successful model for mobilization of activists and media outreach. Unfortunately, the website that they established is now offline, so it's disappeared from public knowledge. The Peace Camp built a website and provided an alternative source of information about conditions at Masha and elsewhere in the West Bank that was further amplified by ISM and indie media. During the summer and fall of 2003, there were 6 other peace camps throughout the northwest districts of the West Bank. The successful elements of the Masha experience were partially overshadowed by the intensification of Israeli repression on all fronts. In March-April 2002, Israel reoccupied the cities of the West Bank, those designated as Area A in the Taba Accords of 1995, dismantling much of the infrastructure and administrative capacity of the PA in the process. A widely circulated interview with a bulldozer driver who demolished dozens of civilian homes during the invasion of Jenin refugee camp in early April epitomized the Israeli army's new spirit. Moshe Nissim, known as Kurdi Bear, told Israel's largest circulation daily Yediot Achronot that he operated his Caterpillar D9 for 75 hours straight while drinking whiskey to avoid fatigue. He had begged his officers to let him destroy more homes and testified with no sense of guilt or shame, "I didn't see with my own eyes people dying under the blade of the D9, and I didn't see a house falling down on live people. But if there were any, I wouldn't have cared at all." In early 2003, the scale of repression directed at internationals, especially those organized by ISM, escalated dramatically. The emblematic persona of international solidarity in this period is Rachel Corrie, who arrived in Palestine as an ISM volunteer in January. On March 16, 2003, she was crushed to death in the Gaza Strip city of Rafah by the same kind of armored Caterpillar bulldozer used to destroy homes in the Jenin refugee camp while she was trying to prevent the similar demolition of a Palestinian home in Rafah. On April 5th, Israeli Army automatic gunfire severely injured Brian Avery, another ISM volunteer in Jenin. On April 11th, an Israeli sniper shot Welsh filmmaker Tom Herndale in the head in Rafah. He went into a coma and died of his wounds 10 months later. Uri Gordon suggests that this escalation in the IDF's use of lethal force sent the international solidarity movement into a crisis, reducing the number of volunteers it could mobilize and creating a vacuum which was partly filled by the young Israelis who coalesced as anarchists against the wall by the end of 2003. However, until the end of 2003, the anarchist affinity groups formed at the Masha camp were unwilling even to adopt a consistent name. The leaflets and press releases they distributed were signed differently each time. The Masha Group, Jews Against Ghettos, etc. Anarchist Against the Wall, Anarchistim Neged Hagader, the fence in Hebrew, happened to be the signature on a leaflet distributed on December 26, 2003, when the group returned to Masha for a demonstration. The gate in the fence at Masha was supposed to allow farmers access to their lands, the same story as in Jayus, but it had been closed for the previous 2 months. A bus full of Israeli activists traveled from Tel Aviv to the outskirts of Masha, where they were joined by other Israelis, internationals, and Palestinians, including some coming from the Der Balut peace camp. In the center of Masha, they met with about 100 village residents. Then, about 200 people marched toward the separation barrier, internationals and Israelis in the front, Palestinians in the rear. Gil Na'amati, a member of Kibbutz Re'im near the Gaza Strip, had been released from his 3 years of compulsory military service only weeks before and was attending his first demonstration. He was in the front ranks of the Israelis and internationals who approached the fence. Some began to shake it, and others began to use wire cutters in an effort to tear it down. There was no threat to the Israeli soldiers on the other side of the fence. Nonetheless, they began shooting live ammunition into the air without issuing any verbal warning or attempting to use non-lethal measures to disperse the demonstration. Minutes later, the soldiers again fired live ammunition and hit Gil Na'amati twice in his leg and knee. An ambulance arrived to evacuate him, but the soldiers refused to open the gate to allow it to proceed to the hospital by the shortest route. So here you see the gate that the soldiers wouldn't open. By the time Gil arrived at the hospital, he was in critical condition due to severe blood loss. The Israeli media and liberal public opinion were shocked by the shooting of Gil Na'amati, especially because television footage showed soldiers taking aim at the protesters from approximately 50 feet away, despite clear appeals to the soldiers in Hebrew not to shoot. It was the first time an Israeli Jew had been targeted by forces meant to protect Israelis from Palestinian terrorism. Gil was foremost among those shocked by the shooting. From his hospital bed, he proclaimed, "I was in the military, and I'm familiar with the rules of engagement. What I did was not even close to something that I think would warrant opening fire. It's unbelievable." While the Army High Command and right-wing government officials predictably defended the IDF, high-profile liberals like former Chief of Israel's General Security Service, Ami Ayalon, and luminaries of the left Zionist Party Meretz of Shalom Vilan and Yossi Beilin publicly stated that orders to shoot unarmed protesters were illegal and should have been obeyed. An editorial in Yediot Achronot correctly noted, "Let's not kid ourselves. If a Palestinian had been shot, it probably would not have merited even one line in the newspaper." After the shooting, Jonathan Pollock, one of the Israeli coordinators of the demonstration, gave testimony to the police regarding the circumstances of the shooting. Then, despite promises he would be released, he was arrested. Although he would reject the designation of leader, Pollock was among the most persistent of the youth who had been engaging in joint direct action with Palestinians since the Masha peace camp. The uproar among liberal Israelis over the shooting soon subsided. Na'amati himself disappeared from the activist scene. The most significant long-term consequence of this bloody event was the consolidation of anarchists against the wall as a formal group. That was the signature on the leaflet the group distributed on the day Gil Na'amati was shot. It received prominent media attention, and they subsequently adopted it. After organizing a demonstration against Na'amati's shooting in front of the Ministry of Defense, the focus of Anarchist Against the Wall's activities turned to the village of Budrus. Participation in the struggle there further crystallized the identity and forms of practice of the group. Demonstrations against the construction of the separation barrier began in Budrus, a very small village, a population of 1,500, on November 11, 2003. From then until December 28th, there were 9 protests in which 1 resident was killed, 300 injured, and 28 arrested. No one from the traditional media attended the demonstrations or reported on them. Unlike at Masha, the Budrus Popular Committee included representatives of all the Palestinian political parties, heads of youth clubs, and school principals. The committee established 3 principles of unity. 1, it would not exclude anyone. 2, the wall would be challenged by steadfastness, sumud, that is, not by armed struggle. 3, the committee called for a new popular intifada, another term indicating rejection of armed struggle, which would impose new strategies on the resistance movement. The 4 Marar brothers, Ayed, Naim, Mohammed, and Abdel Nasser, led the movement in its early days. Ayed, who is known as Abu Ahmed, subsequently emerged as the principal leader of a coalition of popular committees from 9 surrounding villages. On December 29th, 3 days after the events at the Masha Gate, the Budrus Popular Committee organized a large demonstration of about 500 village residents, that's a third of the population, and a few Israelis, among them Jonathan Pollock. After the demonstration, Pollock sent an urgent message to the Masha camp mailing list. It's a longish quote, so I apologize, but here it is. Today, the bulldozers have reached the village of Budrus, which will lose much of its lands and end up enclosed and imprisoned on all sides by the wall, along with the villages of Ni'alin, Midya, and Kibya. The inhabitants of these villages and several international as well as Israeli activists have managed to stop the bulldozers today, but army forces have promised to return tomorrow. People are urgently needed to stay and help at the site. A relatively large number of Israelis and internationals came to demonstrate in Budrus the next day, including a Swedish parliamentarian who was arrested. 2 internationals reported, and this is also longer. Hundreds of women, girls, men, and boys marched directly towards the olive grove. One of the most well-loved activists in the village, Abu Ahmed, shouted, "We can do it." The villagers broke up into 3 groups and started running down the hill towards the bulldozers. The soldiers immediately started firing tens of tear gas canisters at the different groups, before opening fire just minutes later with numerous volleys of rubber bullets. When groups of small girls were gassed, they took only seconds to recover their breath before marching forward again down the hill. Many people were hit in the legs, head, arms, and carried up the hill to the waiting ambulance. All the time, more soldiers were arriving and making their way up the hill. The Palestinians and soldiers met 3/4 of the way down the hill. Although the bulldozer was relatively close now, it seemed that it would be impossible for us to break through the line of heavily armed soldiers and get to the olive grove. The sudden arrival of 3 television crews startled the soldiers. In that moment, an old woman broke through the line and ran at the bulldozer. Different groups started getting around the soldiers. The soldiers recovered their composure speedily and began firing tear gas canisters directly at people. But by this time, the woman had thrown herself into the hole being dug by the bulldozer. A tiny girl, that is Ayed Marar, Iltizam, the daughter of Abu Ahmed, jumped into the bulldozer scooper as it came down to meet the earth and nonchalantly started reading her school book. Other girls started climbing all over the bulldozer, and the driver turned off the engine. That day was victorious for the people of Budrus. Although some trees had been destroyed, others were saved. And in the face of massive amounts of tear gas and rubber bullets, they had advanced down the hill, armed with nothing but songs of freedom, forcing the soldiers and the bulldozer to retreat. When the people reached the olive groves and the soldiers were pushed back to where their jeeps were parked, it was the small girls who faced off against the soldiers for the next 3 hours, singing "Free, Free Palestine." When the soldiers finally got into their jeeps and drove off, the entire village celebrated. There were nearly daily demonstrations for 3 months in Budrus, during which the Israeli army killed a 17-year-old Palestinian and injured nearly 300 others. Among the 33 people who were arrested were Ayed Marar and 2 of his brothers. Due to the extraordinary persistence of the villagers, in March 2004, the Israeli government decided to move the trajectory of the separation barrier closer to the Green Line. According to the original plan, the barrier would have appropriated 1,200 dunams, that's about 300 acres, of Budros's land. The new trajectory took only 176 dunams. Subsequent protest retrieved another 120 dunams, so they lost, all told, only 56 dunams. So this is the Green Line, appropriately green, and this is excuse me, this is not the Green Line. This is the Green Line. And this is the original route. And this is the original route in red. And this is the Green Line is the route, the new route that was established after the protest. So all of this zone in here is land that the village managed to recover. After the first demonstrations in Budros and several nearby villages, popular committees mobilized protest marches in several villages in the Jerusalem corridor further south and east along the trajectory of the barrier. There were also demonstrations in the Salfit region and in the Hebron district. The military response to the demonstrations in the Jerusalem area was exceptionally violent, perhaps because Israeli authorities are particularly insistent on maintaining control of Greater Jerusalem. The late Tanya Reinhardt described a demonstration in Bidu in the daily Yediot Achronot. In response to the violence of the army, the women of Bidu called for a quiet and small protest demonstration of women only on Sunday, April 25th. About 30 Israeli women answered the call, women of diverse ages and from a wide array of occupations. In Bidu, we met with Palestinian women and with women from the international organizations active in the occupied territories. A quiet protest walk ensued. Less than 100 women carrying posters. There was no man in sight, nor children who could potentially throw stones. We constituted no threat whatsoever. But for the army, this does not matter. We will not allow this demonstration, a voice in uniform announced. Tear gas and stun grenades directly followed. On June 30th, the Israeli High Court of Justice ruled that the 30 kilometers of a 40 kilometer section of the separation barrier in the Jerusalem corridor should be rerouted, as there was no security justification for the planned trajectory. Consequently, several Palestinian villages regained a large part of their lands slated for confiscation. However, ruling that one relatively small section of the barrier reinforced the Israeli court's assertion that the great majority of it is legal, a direct contradiction to the opinion of the International Court of Justice announced several days earlier. So it's these areas within the red dashed lines that were recovered. And subsequently, also some others. This is a map of the first stage, and a few other pieces of land were also recovered. Doug McAdams' argument that integration into activist networks is the key factor in recruitment to high-risk activism obviously does not apply to Gil Na'amati, since he had never before participated in a demonstration, could not have had very strong links to any activist network while in active military service, and was motivated primarily by his ideological affinity to the movement. Even though no one imagined that participating in the demonstration at Masha on December 26, 2003 was as high risk an activity for Israelis as it turned out to be, the army had already killed and severely wounded several international activists by then. The intense emotions generated by Gil's shooting and the media attention it received galvanized the resolve of many of those who witnessed it to engage in further high-risk action in Budrus and beyond. Writing about Colombia, Luis Edgar Esparza suggests that rather than thinking of high-risk behavior as a gradual process, we might think of high-risk behavior as a suddenly abrupt change in the nature of one's construction of the world. Repression precipitates and even defines high-risk activism itself. This is consistent with Yossi Bartal's account of his participation in the December 26th demonstration at Masha. Bartal wrote, "First of all, we always thought, we're Jewish. We're not going to be shot by the army. It doesn't happen. That's why there was so much media hype. This was the day I understood really that the state was my enemy. The army is my enemy. I had been shot before with rubber bullets and tear gas, but that was my first time seeing someone being shot with live bullets. It made a lot of us realize that this army and this state are not ours. Uri Gordon, a sympathetic Israeli observer of Anarchists Against the Wall, acknowledges that up to Naamati's injury, Anarchists Against the Wall had operated largely below the Israeli public's radar screen. The state's use of potentially lethal violence against Jewish citizens made the resistance dramatically visible and created a conversational space within the mainstream Israeli media for critiques of the policy of separation. However, Gordon goes on to argue that while attracting media attention, repression is both physically and emotionally dangerous, and it weakens groups' long-term sustainability. Sustainability has, in fact, been an issue for both Palestinian and Israeli participants in joint struggle against the separation barrier and similar campaigns. To the extent that it has been overcome, one explanation is what Elizabeth Jean Wood has called pleasure in agency, the positive affect associated with self-determination, autonomy, self-esteem, efficacy, and pride that comes from the successful assertion of intention. The pleasure of agency is a collective experience. The pleasure in changing unjust social structures through intentional action. Moreover, this pleasure does not depend on actual success. It is about participating in a collaborative effort. Bartal recounted his participation in the Masha Peace Camp. Young Tel Avivian people, punks, gays, lesbians, and transsexuals, came to a village in Palestine. A new thing came about in the radical left. It was the first time we were meeting Palestinians daily and living with them. It was a new thing for Palestinians as well. This was really a place of dialogue. Out of this came a very close relationship between Jews and Palestinians. Both the Palestinians, as Nazih Shalabi recounted, the internationals, Israelis like Nirit Ben-Ari, who are not anarchists, and future Anarchists Against the Wall members like Jonathan Pollock, experienced a political awakening, the pleasure of dialogue, and a taste of the possibility of liberation through their experiences at Jayus and especially at the Masha Peace Camp. Their subsequent actions were at least in part motivated by the desire to sustain and broaden these experiences. Repression and many other problems have taken their toll on the movement, but several villages continue to organize weekly demonstrations in which Israelis and internationals participate. Thank you very much. So where did the microphone go? Josh has the microphone. So we have Q&A and whatnot, and Josh has the microphone, so just raise your hand and he'll bring it to you.
Today's paper had an article about conditions in Gaza, and the countries, I imagine the United States is one, knowing our government, are not funding things, and conditions in life are horrible. It's like similar to a Nazi death camp. I wonder if you're familiar with that.
No, it's not similar to a Nazi death camp, and it's very important not to make that analogy. It's bad. It's very bad, but it's not a Nazi death camp.
I was wondering if you might say something about the likelihood of this kind of basis for activism really being substantial, because it seems to me that what you're talking about is to a large measure a group of outsiders who are already outsiders from the Israeli state and from their own states, in the case of the Bay Area Solidarity Group and so on. And I'm just wondering, this is an explanation for this small group of people, but to what extent do you see this as something that could be the basis for larger movements?
So that requires a prediction that I'm not prepared to make. I'm a historian and not a prophet. But we know that all substantial change begins from the bottom up. The people who initiate change are always marginal to their communities, precisely because the communities that they're trying to change are engaged in activity and enmeshed in social and political structures that resist change. There weren't all that many Northerners who went to Mississippi during Mississippi Freedom Summer. There were even fewer Northerners who participated in earlier activities in the civil rights movement. So the fact that this is a relatively small group of people, although by now I guess that something in the neighborhood of 3,000 to 5,000 Israelis have participated in this activity to one extent or another. The fact that this was a relatively small movement and is even smaller now than it was at its height really says not a lot about what the future may be. Insofar as most people talk about peace, what they talk about is the peace process, which is much more about process than it is about peace. About whether the United States will or won't succeed in reconvening negotiations between Palestinians and Israelis, which it has unsuccessfully mediated for decades. That is a dead end. That process is going nowhere. And the Israeli government intends that it go nowhere. That was the lesson of the failure of Kerry's mediation. And Martin Indyk gave an interview to Yediot Achronot shortly thereafter, pretty much concurring with that assessment of it. So I don't know what is going to happen, but it's very unlikely that there will be two states of the sort that people have been thinking of for quite a few decades now, and that makes it even more important that people learn how to live together.
Thank you for coming today. I'd like to welcome you to Cleveland. For you and for the people in the audience who are students who are not familiar with Cleveland, I could give you just a couple of facts. We have Cleveland Peace Action, and the Palestinians are a huge, one of the biggest Palestinian communities on the west side of Cleveland in the United States. And we have one of the biggest Jewish communities, and it would be very nice if they came together in the same kind of solidarity that you're suggesting. One of our Peace Action members was shot in the head with a tear gas canister at a nonviolent protest in Bethlehem, walking away at the end of the protest. And we've had two Palestinian leaders from Cleveland deported, the imam from the mosque and the leader of the biggest Palestinian club in Cleveland, for what I would consider contrived things. Anyway, I'm going to be short and just say that after the meeting, come to me, and there's two Palestinians are speaking at the Cleveland Heights Lee Road Library this Saturday at 2 o'clock on the Nakba. And as a Beechwood teacher, I went and took my kids to the Holocaust Museum, so I came up with the Holocaust. My dad was in the Holocaust in World War II as an Army officer, but we don't know the Nakba, and we need a comparable Nakba museum to explain what ordeals the Palestinians have gone through. So just this statement that please come to the Nakba speech with two Palestinians Saturday, 2 o'clock at Lee Road Main Library.
I want to say again, the Nakba is not the Holocaust. These two events are not equivalent, and they shouldn't be mentioned in the same sentence.
You talked a lot about people coming into these villages and the protests and the movements in the villages from people coming in. But as a bouncing pad, let's think about Nabi Saleh, and let's think about, like, for example, the Tamimi family over there. Could you tell us a little bit about their experiences and how that's had an effect on them throughout the years? And I know you're not a therapist, you're a historian, but just from your views, if there's anything you could say.
I've been to Nabi Saleh and stayed in their house, so I know them. The Tamimi family is one of the leading families who have led the protest in Nabi Saleh. Nabi Saleh is different from the villages that I discussed here and several other where similar demonstrations have taken place because it's not located on the trajectory of the separation barrier. Its story is that some of its lands were confiscated in the 1970s, I believe, to construct a settlement. And there's a road between the village and the new settlement. And things were going along for quite a while. And then in the late 2000s, settlers seized control of a well that belonged to the village, and that is what set off the, not late 2000s, about 2005, 6, something like that. So that is what set off the protests in Nebi Saleh. The protests in Nebi Saleh have been exceptionally violent. The army often doesn't wait for any teenage boy to throw a stone, and they do there. They simply open fire with tear gas or other non-lethal equipment as soon as they see the demonstrators marching toward the spring. One of the Tamimis was killed, another jailed for quite a long time. I don't know all the details of what's going on there, but what has gone on there very recently. But it's a site where there has been an exceptionally high level of repression.
Thank you for coming. I was just wondering if you faced any political backlash for your work, and if so, from who?
No. The work that is embodied in this lecture was ethnographic field work. But that's legal in Israel, and even in the West Bank. I'm an American citizen. I mean, the only danger was if you stand on the side of the demonstration where the demonstrators are, you might get tear gassed, and I was on a few occasions. But no, nobody tried to interfere with me at all. Well, they started to stop me at the airport, but they ultimately let me in too. So really no big deal. Palestinians are treated much, much worse.
Throughout your talk, you have not mentioned the original purposes of the barrier, which was to prevent terrorism in response to the Second Intifada attacks on Israeli civilians. And the barrier and its security measures have prevented nearly 90% of terror attacks. How do you reconcile this?
So that is, in fact, in the Israeli parlance, the purpose of the barrier. But there's a certain amount of duplicity about that. Not because there wasn't terrorism, of course there was. I'd be the last one to deny that. But if the purpose of the barrier was security, then the place to have built it would have been on the Green Line. That's the internationally recognized border between Israel and the West Bank. But it wasn't built on the Green Line. It was built mostly within the West Bank, as I said. 85% of the barriers inside the West Bank, and it annexes 9.5% of the West Bank, and effectively almost annexes another 3.5%. None of that has international sanction, and that's why the International Court of Justice ruled that the barrier was illegal. So the issue here isn't security for Israelis. I mean, there's more to be said about why there's terrorism and how terrorism actually was escalated during the Second Intifada. We won't go there. But if the purpose of the barrier was first and foremost security, there was a legal place to build it where there would have been absolutely no international argument about it.
Hi, I want to thank you again for coming today. My question is actually sort of a follow-up to what you just said. Several Palestinians, and the one that's coming to mind is currently Christy, who is a Christian Palestinian who once resided in Bethlehem. She herself and many others have expressed their approval of the barrier because it does prevent not only protection for Israelis, but also protection for Palestinians. And so my question to you again is, perhaps Palestinians did lose their land,
No,
or at
not
least a
perhaps. It's quite definite. There's no doubt about
But
it.
my question to you is, with regard to security, how do you reconcile these security measures? And I'll also say that this month marks the four-year anniversary of the deaths of the Fogel family members who lived in the West Bank and who were murdered in their homes on Friday night as they slept.
Your friend Christie is the first Palestinian who I've ever heard of who thinks the barrier provides any security for Palestinians. I don't even understand how that could possibly happen, since the barrier doesn't prevent Israeli security forces from doing whatever they want in the West Bank. The barrier has indeed cut down the number of terror operations coming from the West Bank. It hasn't, obviously, however, provided real security for Israel, nor will it ever.
Hi, thank you for coming. My question has to do with the similarities or any notable differences between the Mississippi freedom activism and the high-risk activism that you've talked about in the past hour. So you mentioned that they should be considered as kind of equivalent situations, but there do seem to be a huge kind of difference in context, or at least that's my initial kind of response to this talk. But so what are the strong similarities between these two situations?
So I actually didn't argue that there were any similarities between the two situations. The talk was conceptually focused around the concept of high-risk activism. That's the only similarity. People were killed in Mississippi for demonstrating, well, not for demonstrating, for registering people to vote and teaching in freedom schools, and people have been killed in the West Bank. That's all. So the question was about why people are willing to participate in protests that involve that level of risk. Otherwise, Mississippi is its own thing, and Palestine is its own thing. I'm just having an argument here with my colleague from the sociology department at Stanford, Doug McAdam. We do that in universities.
Thank you again for this talk. It's been very contemporary, and like you, I'm a historian, and I'd like to ask you to put on your deeper historian's hat and somebody who's looked at peasant movements in the Middle East and peasant modes of expression. Are there deeper connections between this kind of high-risk activism on the part of the Palestinians and Arab traditions in Palestine or elsewhere that you have studied deeper in the past?
That's a very good question. So there are, in 1936, a general strike was declared by the Palestinian Arab national leadership, and 6 months later it was called off and nothing really was accomplished. The British government, which was ruling Palestine as a mandate at the time, decided, though, that this was serious enough so that they should look into how to chill things out. And the Peel Partition Plan was formulated. So it was the first plan to divide Palestine between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean, between the two peoples, which would have given much, much, much less to a Jewish state than it now has. Nonetheless, Palestinian peasants in particular rose up against this, and there was a guerrilla struggle that lasted until the summer of 1939, when, with the help of the Zionist forces that eventually became the Palmach and the Haganah, the British succeeded in suppressing the struggle. So the similarity is that just as in the West Bank, the initiative for these protests was taken by farmers who did not have any kind of consistent formal support from their putative national leadership, so too, during the Great Revolt, as it's called, of 1936-39, once the peasant guerrilla movement began, the nationalist leadership washed their hands of it. The different class background, different political objectives, and so on. So that much is a certain kind of continuity. You could probably say that there was a little bit of that in the resistance that Palestinian Arabs mounted against the 1947 UN partition plan between December of 1947 and April of 1948, when they were essentially defeated before a month before the establishment of the State of Israel. Then came the second phase of the war with the invasion of the Arab armies after May 15th. The difference is that neither in 1937 nor in 1947 and 48 was there any joint action or coordination with Jews of any sort, and no international involvement either. So this is the new factor, which is enabled by the establishment of the State of Israel and the development of an opposition among Israeli Jews. The opposition among Israeli Jews is much broader than the individuals and small groups who demonstrate in the West Bank. This is the leading edge of a somewhat broader but not very big movement among Israeli Jews today.
Most of the examples you showed were resulted in confiscation of Palestinian farmland, although some of it was recovered, and most of it occurred in Area C. Do you think this makes life more difficult for Palestinian farmers, and they frequently migrate to surrounding cities and towns? Do you think that's a policy of Israeli government to annex Area C to Greater Israel?
So lands have been confiscated and made inaccessible and so on. This is a small part of it. By 2000, Israel had confiscated 50% of the West Bank in one form or another, either for settlements or for military bases, or proclaiming them a closed military zone. All of the South Hebron Hills, for example, is now a closed military zone, so the Israeli army can open fire on whoever they want for any reason they want there. They don't typically open fire on the small number of Palestinians who live there, but they do when there are demonstrations and so on. The Israeli government has been very careful from the first day after the 1967 war not to articulate what its policy is towards those territories. So there's no way that we could point to an actual document or cabinet decision or anything like that and say, aha, here it is in black and white. This is the plan of the Israeli government. Historians don't like situations like that. We would like to find the archive and dig out the papers and piece it together to tell the story, and we can't do that because there is no such paper. We can only understand this by inference. And by inference, we see that the Israeli governments, all of them, Labor Party-led governments, Likud-led governments, doesn't matter at all. The objective of Israeli governments appears to have been to settle as much of the West Bank as possible, to make life as difficult as possible for Palestinians in the hopes that they would leave, and some numbers of them have left, although it's unclear exactly how many. Some people say 100,000, some people say 200,000, some people say less. I don't know how one would have a way of knowing. And the idea was that they can shilly-shally in negotiations and keep on consolidating and expanding settlements. So, for example, in the better days of the 1990s, between signing the Oslo Agreement in September of 1993 on the South Lawn of the White House and the Camp David Summit of the summer of 2000, which failed, the number of settlers in the West Bank increased by 70%. Now, if the Israeli government were actually interested in a peace deal, that would make no sense. You wouldn't be establishing more settlements and expanding existing settlements on a territory that you thought you were going to give up in any kind of a peace deal. So what Israeli governments have been doing is advancing the frontier of settlement bit by bit, and then telling the world, oh, so we have communities here. We cannot uproot these communities. That would be inhumane. Not speaking, of course, about the Palestinian communities that were uprooted in 1948 and even subsequently, for that matter. And if you look at the debate inside Israel over this kind of question, what people say is, well, this is how the Jewish state was established in the first place. One dunam, one goat at a time. That was the slogan of the labor movement, of the Zionist labor movement. The several different currents of it that eventually united in what's today the Labor Party. So that was accepted practice, and even many right-wingers would say openly, we're only doing what in Israeli parlance is called the left, the Labor Party, which is not really a left party anymore. We're only doing what the left had historically done, so what's the problem?
I was curious about the young Israeli Jews who are taking part in these activities. When they go back, what kind of reception do they get from their families and their local community?
So it depends. Some of them come from families who are somewhere on the left, not as far left as being willing to participate in a demonstration in the West Bank under Palestinian leadership, but somewhere on the left. They generally are okay. Some of them belong to ultra-Orthodox families. They've broken with their families long before this because they were lesbians or because they were just not going along with the ultra-Orthodox program. Some of them come from average middle-class families, mostly Ashkenazim, mostly secular. I don't know what their relationship with their fathers and mothers are like, but they have a pretty normal social life in Tel Aviv when they come back from demonstrations. I mean, they go to cafes like other Israelis. They do what they do. Some of them are university students. One of them is now doing his PhD in Columbia. I'm sure his parents are proud of him. He's particularly prominent because he got his eye shot out by the army in a demonstration. So there's all sorts of types. I don't think it's easy to categorize them as a particular sector of Israeli society.
Hi, thank you for coming. I'm wondering to what extent you would say that the participation of Israelis and internationals in like resistance, high-risk activism has produced, I guess, what you would call more than or better than average success rate. Would you say that the participation of Israelis and internationals has caused these instances to be more successful than they would have been had they been all Palestinian? And are there observable policy changes within the Israeli government in terms of responding to what the makeup of a protest, so to speak?
It depends, first of all, what you mean by success. Obviously, the occupation hasn't been ended. The biggest successes are in the two cases that I've mentioned, although there are a couple of others as well, where the trajectory of the barrier was changed, but the occupation still continues in full force. I don't think that the ultimate success or failure of these demonstrations and of the broader movement of which they are a part, both among Palestinians and Israelis, has to do with whether the occupation is ended by these actions or not. Certainly, if there hadn't been Israelis and internationals, the Israeli army would have responded with much more violence much sooner, and it's likely that they would have been put down without having any of the even minor successes that they did have. The success of these actions is ultimately going to be judged by whether or not 10, 20, 30 years down the line, whenever this conflict is resolved, and it will be resolved because this is one of the things that it's pretty much the only thing that we learn from history. Nothing stays the same. Conflicts get resolved. There was 100 years war, and then it was over. So I don't know when this one is going to be resolved, but it will be. When this conflict is eventually resolved, will it be resolved on the basis of coexistence or separation? Personally, I think the separation option has pretty much run its course. There aren't going to be two states. It's very, very unlikely that there will be two states of the sort that people have been speaking about for decades. Does that mean automatically there's going to be one state, one person, one vote? No, I don't think so. Neither party wants that. So there's going to be a long period of messiness, violence, that will further indicate the unsustainability of the current situation. And hopefully at the end of that, people will come to some agreement about how they are going to live together in a way that recognizes the national rights of both peoples who live in the country, and without partitioning the country, which is not likely to happen any longer. I don't know what that political arrangement is going to be. But if there is such a political arrangement, if I live to see it, and I may not, if there is such a political arrangement, and if it is based on coexistence and equality, I would then look back to this as one of the experiences that was part of the snowball that made it possible.
I have a question here in the back.
Josh, where are you?
Very enlightening lecture, I must say. I just have a quick question from listening. You mentioned the Ashkenazim Jewish. Could you briefly explain the difference between that group and the Sephardic Jewish, and then tell us which group of those two are basically in control of the Israeli government at this time?
So Ashkenaz is a Hebrew word which means Germany, but today it means basically Jews from Europe. Sfarad is the Hebrew word for Spain. Sfaradim is not widely used in Israel today. It's more Mizrahim, which means Easterners. And that's taken to mean Jews from Arab and Muslim countries, many of whom were never in Spain. So there was a very large Jewish community in Spain that was expelled in 1492, along with all the Muslims. They moved to North Africa, so Morocco was a particularly big community, but also Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt. And many of them also were absorbed in the Ottoman territories, especially Salonika and Izmir and Istanbul and Aleppo. There was historically a sharp, how shall we say this? Zionism is an Ashkenazi movement. Let's start with that. It was a movement that began in Russia and Eastern Europe. Jews who lived in Arab and Muslim countries were, for the most part, opposed or indifferent. They only became involved in any significant numbers during World War II, and even then, in the communities that I've studied the most, Morocco, Iraq, and Egypt, the vast majority of Jews were anti-Zionists. but because of the way the conflict unfolded, they were, many of them, compelled to leave those countries. Very complicated story about how that happened and the role of the Israeli government in actually encouraging it to happen. In the Iraqi case, it's clear. Because Zionism was an Ashkenazi movement predominantly, for many, many, many years, the vast majority of the Israeli political class were Ashkenazim. That began to change in the 1970s and a little bit more in the 1990s, so that by now you've had Mizrahim, who were chief of staff of the Israeli army, minister of defense, foreign minister, the top posts basically except for prime minister. And so one argument is, well, they have been more or less assimilated. And that's true for those who, for Mizrahim who have been able to join the upper middle class. Most Mizrahim, however, haven't been able to join the upper middle class, and so you can still find quite common expressions of vicious racism by Ashkenazim against Mizrahim. There was a debate on the Israeli TV because Israel is having a parliamentary election on March 17th. So yesterday or the day before, there was a debate. I'm not sure what day it happened because I, of course, didn't see it live. I saw it on YouTube. And the Ashkenazi and Mizrahi candidates are insulting each other personally and ethnically and so on. And Israeli politics and society are very rough and tumble. People speak and behave in ways that certainly wouldn't be acceptable in California. Yeah. Josh, can you get this woman?
Yes, thank you for coming. We appreciate your comments. I have a very short question, I think, and that is I'd like to know what you think about the BDS movement as started by the Palestinian civil society and the role of Israelis in that as well.
So that's not a short question, neither is it an academic question. So is it okay if I put on a political hat? I was for quite a while skeptical about this. Not because Israel doesn't deserve on moral and ethical grounds to be sanctioned for the occupation and so on, but because it's a little bit tricky. A month ago, I finished supervising a Palestinian-Israeli student at Tel Aviv University. So she just finished her PhD under my supervision. Now, according to the BDS guidelines, I shouldn't do that. But that seems silly to me. On the other hand, she participated in a seminar at the Van Leer Institution in Jerusalem, and the seminar invited me, and I wrote to her and said, look, Arij, you know that I wouldn't normally come to this, but if you want me to come, I'll come for you. And she said, no, they asked me if they invite me, if they invite you, will you come? And I said, I'm not speaking for him. Invite him and see. So I'm glad you don't want to come. And I didn't go. So a lot of people who don't know very much about Israel and Palestine have latched on to BDS because obviously the peace process as we have known it is reached a dead end. But BDS isn't going to bring Israel under either. We should have no illusions about that. And then people have said really inflammatory and exaggerated things that I don't feel comfortable with. But about a year and a half ago, one of my colleagues, David Palumbo-Yu, was among the group of people who piloted the pro-BDS resolution through the American Studies Association. And I've known David for a long time, and I've known he was interested in this issue for a long time, even though his primary expertise is in Asian American literature. He was chair of the comparative literature department and so on, director of the program in modern literature after I was, modern thought and literature after I was. And I didn't know he was doing this, though. But then he did it, and another colleague wrote a very vituperative article in the Los Angeles Review of Books, which was just factually nonsense. I mean, just it was an embarrassment how ill-informed it was. And at that point, I said, you know, I've been at Stanford for over 30 years. Nobody ever stood up for me when I spoke about this issue. I can't let that happen to David. So I signed on to the BDS. So people who are opposed to BDS should know that the uncivil and outrageous way that that opposition has been expressed has won more people to BDS. And I'm not the only one. This is what happened last week at the Stanford Student Senate, where after collecting 1,900 and some student signatures on a petition to support Stanford's divestment from companies operating in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, the students and the opposition managed to collect all of 319 student signatures. The matter came to a vote, and the anti-divestment people behaved really crudely. I mean, it was quite ugly. The vote was taken. A majority of the senators voted for, but for this sort of thing, they needed 2/3, and they were one vote short. A few days later, 2 of the senators asked for a revote because they said that the atmosphere in the room was so toxic that they couldn't think straight. So the next week, the Senate met, and they passed it. So a lot of, how shall I say, a lot of, I don't like to say pro-Israel because it's not. What's called pro-Israel is advocating Israel's eventual self-destruction, which is where Israel is headed right now. But a lot of people in that camp, you know what I'm talking about, see this as some kind of an existential threat to the state of Israel. It is not that at all. And they become pretty hysterical in public discourse about it. I would like to keep this discussion, even though it's a heated question and very difficult one, for both sides actually. I'd like to keep this discussion in a civil mode, where people talk about what their opponents actually say, not what they say they're thinking without saying, where historical facts actually matter. Not that that means necessarily people will agree, but there's a reasonable way to have a political debate, especially at a university, and there's an unreasonable way to have it, and we should try to have it in a reasonable way insofar as we can.
Thank you for your lecture this evening. I had a question. You spoke earlier about activism versus process, and I just wanted your thoughts on the anticipated participation in the ICC by the Palestinians. Do you see that sort of as futile process, or sort of a form or evolved form of activism? Thank you.
So I was when I speak about process, I was specifically referring to what's called the peace process. That is the negotiations that even preceded Oslo, actually began in October of 1991 in Madrid with U.S. mediation. So that, I think, is a diversion and a waste of time at this point. Going to the ICC, the International Criminal Court, is a good thing mainly because it internationalizes the question. There needs to be some other mediator than the United States. Common sense in mediation theory, an ally of one of the parties to a dispute cannot be the mediator. Duh. But somehow we seem to think that this is a reasonable notion in this case. Well, I never have anyway. So it's important to get institutions of the United Nations, the European Union, the Arab League, engaged in this in some way. Do I believe that anyone has the magic solution? No, because as I said before, I don't know how this dispute is going to be resolved. All I know is I'm very optimistic that it will be resolved. So anything other than begging the United States to be even-handed, which is not going to happen, is worth exploring.
We have time for one last question. Who would like it? Okay.
Shut that down then. How about that?
Thank you for your talk. I just wanted to ask what you think, what your thoughts are about the way this issue is affecting academic freedom on U.S. college and university campuses.
Yes, I'm giving that lecture in 2 weeks in Baltimore. I lived in Israel in the early 1970s for about 3 years. I came back just before the 1973 war. And there was enormous ignorance in this country, far, far more than today. And a group of graduate students at Harvard started to talk about why this war was happening and so on. We were slammed, and people who had those sorts of opinions in those days, when they got their PhDs, had difficulty getting jobs. So this is a long-standing problem with this issue. That began to change in the early 1980s. Israel's 1982 invasion of Lebanon, which was totally unprovoked and so on. That was the first time that a significant number of Americans began to notice that there might be a problem here. And even more so after the first Intifada, 1987, 1990-ish. Other people would say it goes to 93. It's not important. But because that was a completely unarmed uprising, it won a lot of sympathy. And from the mid to late 1980s, all sorts of very interesting things happened. People got jobs. I got a job at Stanford, not too shabby. All of my PhD students have gotten jobs, even the two of them who have written on aspects of Israel and Palestine, although one of them Palestine in the late Ottoman period, so it's not terribly controversial. It is controversial, but it's not the same as writing about the military government in Israel between 1948 and 1966. Many people don't know that Palestinian citizens of Israel lived under a military government during that period. And we won the argument. Intellectually, we won the argument, and the key moment of winning the argument was the publication of Benny Morris's book, The Origins of the Palestinian Refugee Problem, because Benny Morris is an Israeli, despite the English name, and his parents came from England, of course. And the book is based entirely on documents, Israeli documents from declassified archives that make it absolutely uncontroversially clear that large numbers of Palestinians were expelled, some of them directly at gunpoint from their homes during the course of the 1948 war. There were mass executions in villages, there were rapes, there was plunder, and he's very clear about all of this, and then published a second edition of the book in 2001, I think, which is very thick, in which the list of atrocities is elaborated further. So in the wake of Benny Morris's book, people like myself were elected president of the Middle East Studies Association. Well, I can't complain that anybody infringed on my academic freedom if I got elected president of the Middle East Studies Association, and not just me. Suad Joseph, Rashid Khalidi, B.J. Fernia, I could, 10 people at least from the early mid-1980s through early 2000. In 2000, when the Second Intifada broke out, there was a big shakeup because an outfit called Campus Watch, run by Daniel Pipes and Martin Kramer, started to do a McCarthyite tracking of professors who said things about Israel and Palestine that they didn't like. They were pretty unsuccessful. People that they targeted at Columbia got tenure anyway. I was one of the original 12 people that they targeted. Nobody did anything to me at Stanford. I mean, I'm never going to be chair of my department or dean, but those aren't my aspirations anyway. So on the strength of our having won the argument amongst our scholarly colleagues, Campus Watch wasn't very successful. Things began to change after 9/11, because after 9/11, for those of you who remember, Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon came to the United States and said, "Oh, see, now you understand what our life has been like, and we stand with America," and yada yada. And George W. Bush, who is a simpleton, bought that story, and the two struggles against terrorism were united in the global war on terror. And that has had a toll. Although, despite the recent prominence of the Stephen Salaita case and one or two others, Norman Finkelstein a few years before that, and still, by and large, academic freedom is being respected to a reasonable degree in most serious institutions. That's not to say that there are no constraints. I mean, why do we have police here and stuff like that? I mean, first of all, we wouldn't have police if I was giving this lecture at Stanford or any other university. This is the first time that's ever happened. But that tells us that there's some constraints and intimidation and so on. I don't get intimidated very easily, but others might.
All right, I want to thank Professor Beinin for coming, and thank you all for attending. Appreciate it very much.